Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, I have just played bishop e3, and as I said, this gives my opponent immediate equality. To maintain the advantage, I should have played d5, where I have an edge after, as a sample continuation, knight e5 and knight d4, with f4 coming soon. But as before, I didn't want to push in the center straight away, preferring instead to get more pieces out. And that's why I played bishop e3. And here he played bishop g4, which I could have prevented by playing h3 instead of bishop e3, but I figured it more important to get my pieces out, and that's almost always correct in the opening. I was expecting knight g4 instead here in order to hassle my bishop on e3, which I would have then moved to f4. And as it turned out, e3 was a good square for my bishop, and I didn't have to move it again until 25 moves later. So rook c1 is what I played now, which is the second best move as far as Fritz is concerned, and enough to give me a decent edge. Fritz reckons that better was h3, and after bishop h4, g4, and after bishop g6, knight h4, winning the bishop pair. He reckons that was the strongest continuation, but after that it would be drafty around my king, which is something I'm not too keen on. And in post-mortem, Noel said he was curious about this rook c1, and I said to him that I was aiming for tactics on this loose knight at c6 and taking control of the semi-open file, and also applying pressure to the backward pawn at c7, which is a definite target for me in the middle game that's about to start. He answered with rook e8, and I was slightly worried about the prospect of bishop f8 with the threat of b4, forcing this knight to move and winning this pawn on e4 for him. So I played bishop d3, which is moving my bishop for the 4th time, but it's not too serious now that all of my pieces are developed, and also because it's effectively played with tempo because of the threat of knight takes b5 followed with rook takes c6. And if it became necessary, I was planning on playing bishop e2 in order to break this pin. And he saw the threat of knight takes b5 and answered it with queen d7. d5 is what I played now, with the idea of solving the problem of the pin on my knight here, because now the queen is on d7. If he plays knight d5, I can play knight takes c5, and it's fine. Doesn't matter if he takes my queen, I can take his queen. But there was a much stronger continuation than this, which I found about 10 seconds after I played d5 to my irritation, and which Noel pointed out during the post-mortem and said he probably would have resigned if I played it. If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. This is the position here. Knight takes b5 immediately is the move, and this would have got me a decent advantage. His best bet here is bishop takes f3 and not a takes b5, because now I have bishop takes b5, getting my material back with interest after rook takes e2, which he may as well play. He has no way to further protect this knight, but now comes bishop takes c6, and I will be the exchange and a pawn up after the smoke clears with a winning position. So a takes b5 is out of the question. After knight takes b5, he has to play bishop takes f3. Now the correct move for me is g takes f3 and not queen takes f3, or he can break the coming pin on his knight here after a takes b5, bishop takes b5 with knight e5, and if bishop takes queen, then knight takes queen with check, and it's better for black. So in this position, rook e b8 would be his best bet, but now I have knight takes c7, and after queen takes c7, d5. Correct play, or best play continues rook takes b2, rook takes c6, queen a5, and here I would be better, definitely, a clear pawn up with the bishop pair. Although black does have, he's done some structural damage around my king, and he can get play on the queen side for his rooks, but there's nowhere near enough compensation for the lost material. But I missed this line altogether and played instead d5. So he answered with knight b8, which was surprisingly passive, and now I'm 2 tempi ahead. I was expecting knight e5, or I would have exchanged knights and broken the pin, like I said. And here, slightly annoyed with myself for missing that combination the move before, I played queen b3, hoping again for knight takes b5, which I thought would win at least the exchange, but in fact I was mistaken, although it would have given me 3 passed pawns on the queen side, which should have been enough counterplay for the knight, and at worst it was equal. My other reasons behind queen b3 were to protect the a2 pawn from the rook at a8 after knight takes b5, and also to prevent the b4 idea I mentioned earlier, winning the pawn at e4 after this bishop has moved to f8 or d8. And Fritz didn't like this move, queen b3. He preferred instead b4, which is another way to stop black from playing b4 and clamps down on the position. But I did consider this, but I didn't like the loose knight on c3 and also the weakening of the c-file squares on c3 and c4, so I instead played queen b3. And he played bishop takes f3, and this was the obvious risk in my queen move, and Fritz says that black can now get an edge with correct play, but there's nothing too dangerous, and this continuation was of course something I had to consider when I played queen b3. And my conclusion was that the bishop pair, the open g-file, and my grip on the light squares as a whole would be compensation enough for the structural damage around my king and black's resultant dark square control, especially d4 and e5 after my knight on f3 is gone, which he takes f3. And this also solved the problem of my weak e4 pawn, which is another reason why I allowed it to happen. The f3 pawn, which is the new weakness, is harder to attack because it's not on an open file. This pawn on the e-file was, susceptible to the rook. And queen h3 was his next move, which I have to confess I hadn't foreseen, and I was hoping for my knight sack on b5, which was now unplayable, although I considered sacrificing my bishop instead here in order to try and get some play, and that may have been interesting, but Fritz showed it to be totally unsound, and I started to have my doubts about it when I was calculating it. And in the end I decided it was best not to get carried away, but to hold on to the bishop pair, which is my main compensation for the doubled f-pawns here. And I protected my now attacked f-pawn from the queen at h3 with bishop e2. And here he lost his edge straight away with knight bd7, and the position is now equal again. He could have maintained his edge with c5, where best play continues d takes c6 and knight takes c6, and black is slightly better, about a quarter of a pawn ahead, so nothing serious as long as I'm careful, and it's a rich and double-edged position. It would be an interesting middle game. But he played knight bd7 instead, and here I played knight b1 because I was concerned about the threat of knight e5 with further pressure on f3, and this move meant I would be able to play bishop d4 in order to defend f3 with my queen, and also with knight d2 for further protection if it became necessary, and also to free, if a piece or a pawn is attacked twice, you only have 2 defenders and they're tied. But if it's defended 3 times, then they have freedom of movement, so it's good to overprotect sometimes. And also playing bishop d4 would be strong in combination with a rook on the g-file, which of course is going to be a plan now for my middle game now that I've got this open g-file. And with bishop on d4, they're going to be bearing down on g7 together, which was another idea behind this maneuver. And also with knight b1, I'm unmasking the rook, attacking c7. So it's it gains initiative as well. And Noel abandoned the pawn at c7 with another unexpected move, knight f8, which is an alternative and I think weaker route to g6 rather than going via e5, a strong central square. And it was clear now, of course, that he was going for a mating attack on my king, and I had to judge carefully that he wasn't going to be successful. Okay, that's the end of part 2.